Just like with Snow White, Walt Disney took a major gamble on a fairy tale animated feature to save his studio and legacy, this time being Cinderella. When the film was released in 1950, it was the first time since the 1930s that Walt had a success so big it allowed him to greatly expand his company. Thanks to Cinderella, not only was he capable to produce his own live-action movies, TV shows, and build an entire theme park, but he could also create the animated films that he waited for many years to get them started. He took one of his first successful projects and turned it into Alice in Wonderland, took the J.M. Barrie play and expanded with animation on Peter Pan, and turned a story about a dog from the turn of the century into one of cinema's most romantic films with Lady and the Tramp. But throughout all these movies, and even further, the team at Disney were preparing another fairy tale they wanted to tell. One that they have spent most of the 1950s bringing it to life and pushed their artistry even further to elevate the top standards in animation they had already set. First, there was Snow White. Then there was Cinderella. And then there was their next princess, Sleeping Beauty.
It's the story of a princess named Aurora, whom as a baby was cursed by the evil fairy Maleficent to die on her 16th birthday when she would prick her finger on the spindle of a spinning wheel. The three good fairies, Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather, changed the curse so that she would go in an eternal slumber instead, and vowed to raise her in a cottage until she was ready to return. Despite their best efforts avoiding it, the curse was still fulfilled. Now it's up to a prince named Philip, who previously met the girl in the forest, to confront Maleficent and awaken Aurora with true love's kiss. While the film was released by the end of the 1950 decade, the production actually started back at the beginning in early 1951, when after the release of Cinderella, Disney decided to continue using the fairy tale formula, since it had given the company great success with Snow White and the already mentioned Cinderella. While it was a challenge to turn the short Charles Perrault fairy tale into an entire feature film, the story team managed to settle on developing a whole script by 1952. And unlike many other productions, the crew ended up keeping true with the original draft. An impressive feat coming from a movie whose production lasted for many years. While the story may feature some similarities to past princess films, Walt Disney knew that he wanted Sleeping Beauty to stand out from the rest. To have the concept art like the ones done by Mary Blair prominently show in the final picture instead of having it be altered by the artists and animators afterwards. When one of his artists, John Hench, who was designing Disneyland at the time, returned to Walt with unicorn tapestries reproduced by the ones found in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, it gave him just the idea he was looking for: to turn the movie into a living tapestry, as if medieval art would come to life with Disney magic. Among his artists, Walt decided to give one man to be in charge of the movie's look, one with a distinct knowledge of the art style the film was going for, and that was Ivan Earle. At the time, he was a relatively new animator who started in 1951 as an assistant background painter for Peter Pan. But after experimenting his experimental sense with backgrounds and color on a couple of shorts, he quickly climbed up the ranks where now he was assigned to lead the movie's art direction, which he went with a combination of the Gothic style commonly found during the late medieval period and the contemporary abstract aesthetic that was popular in cartoons during the 1950s, mainly through the works of UPA. When it was time for casting, Disney hired opera singer and actress Mary Costa for the role of Princess Aurora. But while her singing was on point for the role, she had to drop her natural southern accent in exchange for a mix of English and mid-Atlantic.
Oh, you darlings, this is the happiest day of my life. Everything's so wonderful. Just wait till you meet him.
As for Maleficent, Eleanor Audley returned to be both the voice and the live-action model of the villain, just like she previously did for Lady Tremaine in Cinderella. By 1953, the film's development seemed to be going smoothly. A story reel was done, the actors recorded their lines, and the team was about to start getting into the animation and be ready for it to come out in 1955. However, Walt himself proved to be the movie's biggest obstacle. He wasn't liking some of the creative choices and made his crew rework on some key scenes while also delaying the release. He also decided to drop the original score and songs done by Jack Lawrence and Sammy Faye in favor of George Bruns adapting the music from Tchaikovsky's ballet of Sleeping Beauty. The only song by Lawrence and Faye that managed to get into the movie was Once Upon a Dream.
I know you, I walked with you once upon a dream.
And if Walt being tough to please wasn't enough, the movie also stumbled on another big hurdle when the director, Wilfred Jackson, suffered a fatal heart attack. This resulted in one of the 9 old men, Eric Larson, to step in and take his place. However, his role as director did not last long, as the only scene he worked on was the sequence where Aurora sings to her animal friends in the forest and then meets Philip. It may not seem like much, but that scene in particular was infamous in the studio for taking almost 2 years to rework on to get it right, and went beyond over budget that it ended up becoming more harmful to the film than do good. While he still worked at Disney for many years afterwards and is still regarded as a highly admirable figure in the field of animation, this was the only time that Larson got to direct. After Eric, Clyde Geronimi stepped in to direct while Wolfgang Reitherman and Les Clark helped out as sequence directors. While the 9 old men are mostly noted to animate the feature, there were several notable people that worked on the film that would later become prominent figures in animation. Don Bluth and Floyd Norman, Disney's first noteworthy African-American animator, started their careers working on Sleeping Beauty, and once even had Chuck Jones. And yes, I do mean the same legendary Looney Tunes director Chuck Jones. How the fridge did that happen? Well, momentarily, during the mid-1950s, Warner Brothers shut down their animation division in order to produce more 3D films, thus resulting Jones to work at Disney for 4 months. But when the whole 3D thing flopped, Warner Brothers brought animation back and Chuck returned to be back with Bugs.
Yeah, ain't we a bunch of stinkers?
But even with new directors keeping things in check, that doesn't mean this wouldn't be causing any more trouble. In fact, it kinda made things worse. Since Earl was in charge of the art direction, there would always be this constant creative clash with him against Geronimi and the animators. No matter what, Ivan would have the final say of the visuals, but the animators hate how the backgrounds are so detailed to the point that it would take attention away from the characters they would animate. That, and it was always a struggle to find the right balance of classic Disney traditions and the film's contemporary gothic look that Walt wanted. But it was the animators that helped preserve some of the Disney elements and charm to the feature, including Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston on The Three Good Fairies, John Lounsbury on The Kings, Stephen and Hubert, Milt Kahl for Prince Philip, and Mark Davis animating both the protagonist and antagonist, Aurora and Maleficent. After several delays caused by production troubles and Walt's focus often shifting to his other projects, the feature, which was the first 70mm animated film, was finally complete and released on January 29th, 1959, and its initial run was anything but a beauty. The film received some mixed reactions from critics, stating that the voices were great, but the story felt like it was just copying Snow White, and they were even iffy on the animation. As for the box office, it did get $5.3 million, which was okay, but made Disney lose money due to the film being too expensive with a $6 million budget. While the film turned out to be cursed, it would only be fitting that Sleeping Beauty would become a sleeper hit. After it returned to the big screen in 1970, the film received several re-releases and accumulated a new box office total of $51.6 million, making it the second highest grossing film of 1959 behind Ben-Hur. When Walt Disney made Disneyland while the movie was in production, he decided to promote the feature by naming the iconic castle after the film as Sleeping Beauty Castle, and in 1957, Disney added a walkthrough in the castle that presented a diorama telling the story of the movie. Years later, Sleeping Beauty would also have its name given to the castles of Disneyland Paris and the first castle of Hong Kong Disneyland. As time moved on, as the film gained more love from the public and the characters becoming fondly remembered like Aurora and the fairies, it is actually Maleficent that emerged as the most memorable character of the feature. So much so that she is often regarded as the greatest Disney villain. In fact, it wasn't just in this movie where she would be the mistress of all evil and turn into a dragon. She was a notable villain in the Kingdom Hearts games, made appearances in the series Once Upon a Time, and even fought against Mickey Mouse in the nighttime show Fantasmic. Her legacy as a villain is so renowned that she even got her own movie in 2014 starring Angelina Jolie. The film was such a big hit by getting $758.5 million at the box office that it even spawned a sequel 5 years later called Maleficent, Mistress of Evil. However, they are both reimaginings that portray her more as an anti-hero that are not as liked as much as the animated film for both critics and audiences.
Oh dear, what an awkward situation.
As the film became older, it gradually gained its status as Disney royalty, where it started getting some award recognition by earning a Grammy nomination for Best Soundtrack of a Motion Picture or Television Series, and an Oscar nomination for Best Original Score for a Musical Picture. And on December 2019, the Library of Congress added the film onto the National Film Registry for preservation. Going back a bit, on October 2008, Disney released the Platinum Edition of Sleeping Beauty on Blu-ray and DVD, and restored the full negatives for the ratio to become 2.55 to 1, even wider than the original 70mm release, and made it the first time ever that Sleeping Beauty was presented in its full original state almost 50 years later. The movie's fame was in slumber for many years after its first appearance, but it eventually woke to receive complete admiration for its amazing artistry that inspired many artists and beloved characters that are still highly prominent to this day. It may even had to fight for that glory, like combating a fire-breathing dragon, but it did manage to earn its happily ever after, just like Sleeping Beauty did once upon a dream. Okay, so maybe the fairy tale formula isn't always a guarantee to result in a successful movie. How about for the next one, let's switch things up to have a more modern setting, and instead of dealing with princesses and spells, it'll be a movie with down-to-earth people and talking animals. They've had some good luck with that before, but hopefully that luck could also help them on 101 Dalmatians, based on the children's novel The 101 Dalmatians by Dottie Smith. It's about two Dalmatian dogs who are also a couple named Pongo and Perdita, in which their owners, Roger and Anita, are a couple as well that met because of their dogs. After giving birth to 15 puppies, Anita's old schoolmate, Cruella de Vil, now a cold-hearted and wealthy fur coat collector, unsuccessfully tried to buy the puppies to turn them into a new coat. But since she is a nutcase that's too used to getting what she wants, she had her two henchmen, Horace and Jasper, to steal the puppies. But now that all the dogs are on high alert of the missing pups, it's up to the litter of 15, along with 84 additional Dalmatian puppies and some animal helpers along the way, to escape Cruella's wrath before they all become one of her fur coats. When Walt Disney first read the original book in 1957, which was relatively new at the time as it was released the year prior, he immediately saw the potential as an animated film and quickly got the rights. But while his attention in those years were less on animation, he assigned the duties of adapting the book onto Bill Peet, and only to Bill Peet, where he both wrote the film by hand and did the entire storyboards, making it the first time for a Disney animated film to be written by only one person instead of an entire team. On a side note, it was also the first Disney animated feature to be set in the time when the film was released, where the characters are doing modern things like watch television. Miraculously, even if Bill was a one-man show, Walt thought it was great stuff. They were so good, in fact, that even Dottie Smith herself thought that Pete improved what she did in her original book. When it was time to get into the animation, Walt wanted to make sure that the same mistake wouldn't happen twice. Since Sleeping Beauty made the company lose money for being over budget, a key goal for the visuals is to be as cost-effective as possible. Oh, Disney found a way to save money, all right, but it also ended up revolutionizing the process of producing animation. Enter Walt's good old friend Ub Iwerks, who invented a new animation technique where he modified a Xerox camera so it can directly transfer the lines in a drawing onto an animation cell.
My God.
Thus saving both time and money by skipping the inking process.
Disney, you nonsensical jerk!
Before 101, the studio made a couple of tests to get a good feel of it with a few scenes in Sleeping Beauty and the 1960 short Goliath 2. As a result, the animators fell in love with the Xerox process, since for the first time, they get to see their drawings come to life in the final film without the ink and paint department intervening in the middle. One of them that was so fascinated by the new process was Ken Anderson, who took on the role of art director and planned to have this be the first animated feature completely done by the Xerox process, which also makes Sleeping Beauty the last Disney animated feature to use hand-painted cells. In order to accommodate the character's new look of having fully black outlines instead of colored, Anderson teamed up with color stylist Walt to have the backgrounds also reflect on the new Xerox look, where Paragoy would use an impressionistic approach to the colors while the lines fill in the details. Fascinatingly, the Xerox doesn't just work on drawings, but with the right technique, it can also work on film footage. For any of the cars like Cruella's or Horace and Jasper's, the team built white models with black outlines and filmed them driving or flipping around depending on what the scene demanded. From there, the shots went through the Xerox process to seemingly blend with the 2D environments while also giving the cars a bonus 3D look. In a way, it's like an updated process of how the team used the models to present the wagons in the animation of Pinocchio. Also, one great benefit of having the Xerox process for this picture is that it makes animating all the spots on the Dalmatians easier. But that doesn't mean it wasn't a crazy task. With the millions of spots that had to be carefully placed on each dog, there was an entire team dedicated to animating just the spots. However, even if this new technique was very beneficial for the production schedule and the budget, one person who was not a fan of this art direction was Walt himself. He hated it so much that he never wanted Ken to be an art director like that afterwards. It wasn't until years later, when Anderson saw Walt for the last time, he might have had a change of heart.
Walt came into the studio, and I was so grateful and glad to see him. I said, "Gee, it's good to see you, Walt." He said, "Ken, it's sure good to be here." And then he looked at me and penetratingly with the eyes, and I knew that he was forgiving me for this thing I had done on the Dalmatians. He didn't say anything, but I know I was forgiven. That as far as he was concerned, it wasn't so bad after all.
As a Disney animated film that featured dogs, it wouldn't be hard to imagine that the skills the animators learned from Lady and the Tramp would be used again for this film. But that wouldn't be the only thing from that movie that would also appear in this one. During the Twilight bark scene, several dogs from Lady and the Tramp would make a cameo to participate in the bark, including Jacques, Peg, Bull, and then later both Lady and Tramp appear to help out. Straight after his work on Aurora and Maleficent for Sleeping Beauty, Mark Davis went to animate similar characters with the main human female leads with Anita and Cruella de Vil. Especially for the villain, it was a major contrast from the previous feature to animate, where Maleficent was subtle and subdued, Cruella was outlandish and bombastic. This would ultimately be the grand finale of Mark Davis's career in animation, as he would later move on to WED Enterprises, now called Walt Disney Imagineering, as a character designer for many of Disney's most beloved attractions. When it was released on January 25th, 1961, it was the exact success they needed to pick themselves up after Sleeping Beauty. On a much lower budget of $3.6 million, the movie received a domestic gross of $14 million. On top of that, the movie was also highly beloved by critics, stating that even if the movie differs from their previous features, they still consider it one of Disney's best films. Following its release, the movie received a BAFTA award for Best Animated Film, and like Maleficent, Cruella would go on to become one of Disney's most iconic villains and even got to number 39 on AFI's Top 100 Greatest Villains. In 1996, many years before they made a habit out of it, Disney created a live-action remake written by John Hughes and starring Glenn Close as Cruella, which went on to also become successful like its animated counterpart, where it then got a sequel in 2000 called 102 Dalmatians. 3 years later, the animated film also received a sequel called 101 Dalmatians 2: Patch's London Adventure. But the dogs weren't just about the movies. They also had 2 TV shows, with the first release in 1997, where it went on to have 2 seasons with 65 episodes, and another in 2019 called 101 Dalmatian Street. After the numerous of re-releases it had, its box office total would grow exponentially to having $303 million. When the film was released on Blu-ray for the Diamond Edition on February 2015, a new animated short was made as a bonus called The Further Adventures of Thunderbolt, which fully presented the next episode of the show that the dogs were watching on television. As Disney was entering the 1960s, they did so by trying something completely new, both with their storytelling and their animation, and the result put them not at 100%, but one spot higher at 101. With the Xerox process now in their arsenal, the confidence for animation came back to Disney with a fresh new look. So much so that they decided to return to the realm of fantasy and see if they can conjure up some new magic with The Sword in the Stone, based on the novel of the same name by T.H. White. Deep in the core of medieval London, England, lies a sword inside an anvil that proclaims that the one who removes the sword shall be the new King of England. But since no one can pull it out, the land fell into the Dark Ages. Meanwhile, an orphan boy named Arthur, but often referred to as Wart, met an eccentric wizard named Merlin who decided to be his tutor and teach him about life lessons and science by transforming each other into various animals. But during his pursuit for knowledge, both Wart and Merlin have to face some foes that stand in the way of their education, like carnivorous animals, Wart's own foster father and brother, and a mad witch named Madame Mim, which, if overcome, then Wart will discover that he is meant for greatness beyond his imagination. While the production was mainly done during the early 1960s, this was a project that had been on Walt's shelf for several years. Much like last time, he got the rights to the book in 1939 when the novel came out the previous year, and didn't even get the initial storyboards until a whole decade later. It wasn't until after production was done on 101 Dalmatians in 1960 when the real work was being put into it. However, it didn't just start production and go from there. Much like pulling the sword out of the stone, it had to prove its worth and even compete against another potential movie for Walt's approval. On one side, a group of some of Walt's top animators, including Ken Anderson, Mark Davis, Milt Kahl, and Wolfgang Reitherman, developed an idea for a more contemporary adaptation of Chanticleer. Based on the Edmund Rodstad satirical play, it was another project that the Disney team tried since the 1930s to turn it into an animated feature. For several months, the team worked on developing concept art, character sketches, and a whole story reel to present their idea at its highest potential. Meanwhile, for The Sword in the Stone, there was only one man who was left in charge of adapting the whole story. While it may seem like a total disadvantage for one guy to compete against the top animators for Walt's endorsement, keep in mind that it was the same guy that developed the story of 101 Dalmatians all on his own, Bill Peet. When the day came for both to get Disney's approval, it was a tough choice between one with great material to work with that was in production for decades, while the other recently sparked his interest after seeing the Broadway production of Camelot. After making their presentation, and Walt considered the possibilities on both,
the winner is The Sword in the Stone!
After expressing that he had issues with the thought of a rooster being an appealing protagonist, Walt ultimately chose The Sword in the Stone to be his next animated movie. The animators were quite salty at first by the decision, but did admit defeat, and most went on to work on the feature, like Ken as the art director, Milt as a directing animator and character designer, and Wooly becoming Disney's first solo director. For the voice of Wart, they hired child actor Ricky Sorensen. However, during the middle of his recording, he was hitting puberty and his voice dramatically changed.
Could you turn me into a fish?
Well, do you have any imagination? Can you imagine yourself as a fish?
Oh, that's easy. I've done that lots of times.
I pulled it out of an anvil that was on a stone in a churchyard.
So, to keep the same childlike voice that Ricky had before, Reitherman brought two of his sons, Richard and Robert, to provide the rest of Wart's dialogue needed. Originally, Merlin, whom Bill Peets secretly modeled after Walt since they both share similar personalities and nose, was supposed to be voiced by Julius Matthews, and his owl, Archimedes, was meant to be played by Carl Swenson. The roles didn't quite fit for them well, so the best solution was for them to switch characters and let their magic do the rest. In terms of Disney's first, it's not just that this was their first animated film to have just one director, but this is also their first animated film to have songs written by the Sherman brothers, Robert and Richard. Beforehand, they began at Disney only a few years prior by doing songs for live-action features like The Absent-Minded Professor and The Parent Trap, and projects starring some of the Mouseketeers like the TV movie The Horsemasters. When it was released on Christmas Day 1963, the reviews weren't so keen to the new king. While critics highly enjoyed the characters, and to this day, the Wizard's duel scene is often regarded as some of the best animation done by the Nine Old Men, they felt like there was little substance to get from the feature due to the little amount of plot in the film. As for the box office, it was a much more pleasant sight, as it became a hit by earning $4.75 million in theater rentals on a $3 million budget, which later the film received a domestic total of $22.2 million. The film also received an Oscar nomination for Best Score in an Adaptation or Treatment. Later on, both sorcerers would make some prominent appearances in several Disney areas. Madame Mim occasionally appears in the Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck comics by teaming up with the villains, while Merlin would host a ceremony at several Disney parks where one guest can pull the sword out of the stone to become king or queen for the day. He also frequently appeared in the Kingdom Hearts games, whose role is often holding the book that would lead players into the 100-Acre Woods. While it may not have come out as Disney's greatest or most remembered animated film, it still has an admirability of the way that it had to fight its way to become a reality, and its charming characters and a few key moments are still beloved by audiences to this day. It has its problems, it has its strengths, but it still made a significance that makes the world go round. While The Sword in the Stone was still a financial hit, Walt was bothered by the fact that critics didn't enjoy it as much as some of his other works like 101 Dalmatians. He was aware that he wasn't giving as much attention to his animated works as he used to, so he decided to be more involved with his next movie that could deliver some highly interesting characters and could possibly win the critics over. And that was The Jungle Book, based on the anthology novel of the same name by Rudyard Kipling. In the jungles of India, a boy named Mowgli was living with the pack of wolves that raised him since he was a baby. When news broke out that the fearsome tiger Shere Khan returned to the jungle, a friend of the wolves, a black panther named Bagheera, volunteered to bring him to the man village where he could be safe. The biggest problem with that is not the journey of going there, but rather the fact that Mowgli doesn't want to leave the jungle, which results him getting constantly sidetracked where he encounters many other animals that either want to befriend him or want to eat him. After the release of The Sword in the Stone, Bill Peets suggested to Walt a new idea that could be their next potential animated feature. He presented the Kipling book, telling him that there's a lot of opportunities to play with a variety of characters, and Disney gave him the thumbs up, where once again, Pete is left on his own devices to develop an entire story for the feature. In Pete's original draft, it was a lot darker and more serious, while also staying true to the Mowgli stories of the original source material. He also created a new character that would be the king of the monkeys named Louie that would force Mowgli into showing him how to make fire. Along with Bill, Terry Gilkyson was hired to write several songs for the feature whose tone stuck close to the book as well. However, as I said before, Walt wanted to be a bit more involved in the production after the critical disappointment of The Sword and the Stone, and that was when trouble really went into full swing. Disney hated the dark approach to the story, which often caused him to be in a big clash with Pete. After several long arguments over the story, Bill Pete ultimately decided to quit on January 1964. Walt would then go and completely scrap all of Gilkyson's songs, but the team begged him to keep one that they highly enjoyed, which ended up becoming the most recognizable song of them all.
Look for the bare necessities, the simple bare necessities.
In their place, Walt brought on board Larry Clemens to replace Pete, along with 3 other storymen, and brought back the Sherman Brothers to write new songs, along with helping out on Walt's new take on the story that had one specific requirement.
We were at this meeting, and the first thing Walt said, I remember, how many fellas have read the original Jungle Book story by Rudyard Kipling? And nobody said anything because nobody had read it. He says, good, I don't want you to read the book.
Wait, what? Huh. And here I was wondering who the fridge is Rikki Tikki Tavi. Oh well.
While most of the original draft was thrown out, other than the bare necessities song, one piece that Walt still kept from Bill Pete's ideas was the personality of the characters, and wanted to put that in the forefront of the feature above all else. In a rare moment, Disney decided to use recognizable celebrity voices in order to help shape the characters and even have them be a bit of a caricature of their respected actors, starting with Phil Harris as Baloo. At first, it was tough to convince him to be on board, since Harris and even the crew felt like his wisecracking comedy seemed out of place for a movie based on a Rudyard Kipling novel. But once Phil started improvising and acted more like himself instead of what the script told him to do, he turned out to be a perfect fit for the part. Following afterwards, other famous actors got casted in their suitable roles, like Sebastian Cabot as Bagheera, George Sanders as Shere Khan, and Louis Prima as King Louie. But despite the big names at the time, there was one popular group that Walt wasn't able to get for the film, and that was the Beatles. Originally, they were planned to play the part of the Vultures, which explains their mop-top haircut and Liverpool accents, and their song, That's What Friends Are For, was originally a rock ballad. However, since John Lennon refused to lend his voice in an animated film, the crew hired other voice actors instead, and the song was rearranged to become a barbershop quartet to make it more timeless. There was also a nearsighted and dim-witted rhino named Rocky that would hang out with the Vultures with the voice of Frank Fontaine, but was cut out because the Vultures and Monkeys already took a lot of screen time. But not everyone involved in the cast were big names of the 1960s. Several veteran Disney voice actors joined the cast as well, like J. Pat O'Malley, Sterling Holloway, and Verna Felton. Originally, child actor David Bailey was supposed to be the voice of Mowgli, but during the middle of production, he hit puberty and his voice no longer fit the part. To make sure the same mistake from The Sword and the Stone wouldn't repeat, director Woolie Reitherman brought his third son to take Bailey's place. Robert and Richard already had their turn with Wart, so now it's Bruce's time to shine in the starring role and keep Mowgli's voice consistently young throughout the movie. It wasn't his first role in an animated Disney project though, as he previously just did the voice of Christopher Robin in the 1966 short Winnie the Pooh and the Honey Tree. As it is a movie where the characters interact with each other more often than in other animated films, the animators had to work closer together and each were assigned to work on segments instead of just one character. In fact, some had to lead the way to present the others on how they had to be drawn. Ken Anderson did the character designs, Milt Kahl did some preliminary animation to show how they move, while the other animators did the rest to create their animation magic, along with everyone helping each other out. When developing the rest of the songs, the Sherman Brothers' job is to take the dark and mysterious parts of the original source material and flip them upside down in order to make them fun musical numbers. But at the same time, they were also instructed that the songs should help advance the plot instead of putting it to a halt to show a random song and dance number, which was why they were heavily involved in the story process. For one of their songs, Robert and Richard took one of their unused songs from Mary Poppins, Land of Sand, and turned that slow tempo tune into a hypnotic serenade with Ka's song, Trust in Me. But while Walt and the crew were focusing more on bringing these personalities to life, the hardest part for them was to figure out how to conclude the story and have Mowgli ultimately return to the Man Village, especially when they can't use the book to help them either. The solution that Walt figured out was a girl that would entice him to go with her. While it sounded strange at first, the animators warmed up to it once they figured out the right ideas to pull it off. When the film welcomed audiences to the jungle on October 18, 1967, Walt finally received the praise he was looking for. Critics were well aware that it's nothing like the Rudyard Kipling book, but they still loved how it was a lot of fun and beautifully crafted. The same can be said for audiences, since they helped packed up theaters to make the movie a big hit, earning $11.5 million in domestic theater rentals, and later, after the numerous of re-releases, grew its grand total into $378 million. Funny enough, even though most of the songs were from the Sherman Brothers, the one song that got an Oscar nomination was actually Terry Gilkison's The Bare Necessities, and it actually got very close to getting nominated for Best Picture, but it never happened. During the 1990s, Disney made 2 animated series based on Mowgli's animal friends, including Jungle Cubs, where the animals were kids that ran for just 2 seasons with 21 episodes, and Tailspin, where it stars Baloo and features Louie and Shere Khan, where the bear flies an airplane and runs an air cargo freight business that ran for 65 episodes. Because when you think of Baloo from Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book, you think of the big gray sloth bear, deep in the jungle of India, mentoring the man cub about the laws of the land. And he's also one heck of a bush pilot! You know, just like what old Rudy always intended. But those weren't the only times when Disney tried something new with The Jungle Book during the 90s. In 1994, Disney released a live-action remake of the film called Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book, which, despite the name, was very loosely based on the book and the animated film, and 4 years later, they produced a direct-to-video feature called The Jungle Book: Mowgli's Story. In 2003, a sequel was released in theaters called The Jungle Book 2, which featured a more modern all-star cast including Haley Joel Osment, John Goodman, Tony Jay, and Phil Collins. While definitely not as liked as its predecessor, it still managed to make some good money at the box office. But that's nothing when compared to the achievements made by the second and even bigger live-action remake of the animated film, the 2016 movie directed by Jon Favreau. That movie was highly praised by critics, and it's often considered to be Disney's best live-action remake, along with earning $966.6 million at the box office and winning an Oscar for Best Visual Effects. Ever since its release, it was often noted to be an inspiration for many, and for millions of people, the fun-loving nature of the film won their hearts to make this Disney film one of their favorites. Now with Walt back getting more hands-on with the process like in the 1930s, the animation team can look forward happily knowing that they got the bare necessities to produce even more classics.
Well, come on, let's go and congratulate our friend.
Hold it, fellas. Now's not the time for it. Look.
This is Beach Rogers in the KFWB newsroom. We have a bulletin from Burbank, which is going to sadden the entire world. Walt Disney, the man who built an entertainment empire on a cartoon character, has died today at the age of 65. Of course, he was the creator of Mickey Mouse, the beloved cartoon characters, and Disneyland. Walt Disney, dead at the age of 65 this morning.
He didn't say anything, but I know I was forgiven. That as far as he was concerned, it wasn't so bad, after all. So it meant a lot to me. And then I found out, of course, 2 weeks later he was gone.